The topic of sexual cruelty on slave ships is a harrowing aspect of the transatlantic slave trade that underscores the extreme brutality and dehumanization endured by enslaved Africans. The Middle Passage, the leg of the triangular trade where enslaved people were transported from Africa to the Americas, was characterized by horrific conditions, including rampant sexual abuse and exploitation. This article aims to provide a detailed and explicit account of the sexual violence perpetrated on slave ships, highlighting the systemic nature of this cruelty. The transatlantic slave trade, which lasted from the 16th to the 19th century, involved the forced transportation of millions of Africans to the New World. The Middle Passage was the most infamous and brutal part of this journey, where enslaved individuals were packed into ships under deplorable conditions. The physical suffering, disease, and high mortality rates are well-documented aspects of this journey. However, the sexual violence inflicted on enslaved Africans, particularly women and young girls, remains a deeply disturbing and often underexplored dimension of this atrocity. Sexual violence on slave ships was not an isolated or sporadic occurrence. It was a systemic aspect of the transatlantic slave trade. European captains, crew members, and even fellow enslaved individuals participated in the sexual exploitation of African women and girls. The patriarchal and racially hierarchical structures of the time facilitated and normalized such abuse. Enslaved women were seen as property and were subjected to the whims of their captors, who viewed them as objects for sexual gratification. Upon being captured and brought aboard the slave ships, African women were immediately vulnerable to sexual exploitation. Stripped of their clothing and dignity, they were subjected to invasive and degrading inspections by the ship's crew. These inspections were ostensibly to assess their health and suitability for labor, but they often involved sexual molestation and assault. During the voyage, enslaved women were segregated from the men, often confined to the lower decks of the ship. This segregation did little to protect them from abuse. In fact, it made them more accessible to the crew. The confined and overcrowded conditions of the ships provided little privacy or protection, and the crew took advantage of this to exploit the women sexually. The sexual cruelty inflicted on enslaved women on slave ships took many forms, each more dehumanizing than the last. Rape and sexual assault. Rape was a common occurrence on slave ships. Captains and crew members often raped enslaved women, considering it one of the perks of the voyage. These assaults were brutal and relentless, leaving women physically and emotionally scarred. Young girls were particularly vulnerable, as their age made them easy targets for predatory crew members. 2. Sexual coercion. In some cases, enslaved women were coerced into sexual relationships with crew members in exchange for small favors or slightly better treatment. This form of coercion was particularly insidious, as it forced women to choose between enduring sexual abuse and securing their survival, or that of their children. 3. Public humiliation. Sexual violence on slave ships was often conducted publicly, serving as a form of humiliation and control. Women were raped in front of other enslaved individuals, reinforcing their powerlessness and the absolute authority of the crew. For forced breeding, although more commonly associated with plantations, the concept of using enslaved women for breeding purposes sometimes began on the ships. Crew members impregnated enslaved women during the voyage, ensuring a continued supply of enslaved individuals once they reached their destination. The psychological impact of sexual cruelty on slave ships was profound and long-lasting. Enslaved women endured unimaginable trauma, stripped of their autonomy, and subjected to constant fear and degradation. The sexual violence they experienced left deep emotional scars, affecting their mental health and well-being long after the voyage ended. For many, the trauma of the Middle Passage continued to haunt them for the rest of their lives. Despite the overwhelming odds, enslaved women sometimes found ways to resist their oppressors. Acts of resistance included refusing advances, physically fighting back, or attempting to protect younger girls from abuse. These acts of defiance, though often met with severe punishment, demonstrated the resilience and courage of enslaved women in the face of unimaginable cruelty. The sexual violence endured by enslaved women on slave ships had a lasting legacy. It contributed to the pervasive sexual exploitation of enslaved women in the Americas, where they continued to be viewed as property and subjected to abuse. The trauma of these experiences was passed down through generations, affecting the descendants of enslaved individuals and shaping the history of African American women. The sexual cruelty on slave ships is a deeply disturbing aspect of the transatlantic slave trade that underscores the dehumanization and brutality of slavery. By acknowledging and understanding this history, we can honor the resilience of those who endured such horrors and ensure that their stories are not forgotten. The legacy of sexual violence during the Middle Passage serves as a stark reminder of the inhumanity of slavery and the enduring impact of systemic oppression.